The Hive Queen's own body declared her dead. Every healer in the room agreed with it. Only one person in that entire chamber refused to listen to a corpse, and she was the only one in the room who wasn't born on this planet. Nobody in the Vessari continuum had ever seen a human get angry at a dead body before. They were about to. The Threshold Spire rose out of the amber jungle of Kethrun like something grown instead of built, because that's exactly what it was. Every wall pulsed faintly with bioluminescent veins, every corridor smelled like warm honey and static electricity, and every single person who worked inside it could hear the low collective hum of 10 million minds breathing in unison. That hum was called the chorus. It was the reason the Vessari Hive had gone 12,000 years without a single war. When you can feel your neighbor's grief in your own chest, you tend to think twice before starting a fight. 12,000 years without a war sounds like paradise until you actually live inside it for 6 months. Then it starts to look a little different, less like peace, and more like a species that had simply forgotten how to fight, because they'd never once needed to. Every hallway in the spire was quiet in a way Earth hospitals never were. No shouting, no monitors screeching, no exhausted residents arguing over a chart at 3 in the morning, just soft light, softer voices, and a low musical hum underneath everything, like the whole building was humming a lullaby to itself. Mara used to find it peaceful. After today, she'd never hear it the same way again. Dr. Mara Quinn was not part of the chorus. She never would be. She was human, and humans were deaf to it, blind to it, completely locked out of the one sense every Vessari citizen relied on more than sight or sound. To them, she wasn't just foreign. She was silent. A walking void in a room full of connected minds, and for 6 months, that silence had made her about as welcome at the spire as a power outage at a funeral. She'd taken the exchange posting anyway, partly for the science, mostly because her ex-husband got the house in Ohio and she needed to be anywhere that wasn't Ohio. Mara had spent 11 years as a trauma nurse in Cincinnati before crossing over to combat medicine, 2 tours patching up soldiers in conditions that would make a Vessari healer faint just hearing about them. She knew what a human body did when it was trying to die. She'd learned, the hard way, that biology doesn't care about your feelings, your rank, or your royal bloodline. It just runs on rules. Pressure, oxygen, time. She respected those rules the way some people respect the ocean, not because it's kind, but because it doesn't lie to you. Her father used to say she had ambulance hands, steady when everyone else's were shaking. He'd meant it as a compliment back when he was alive to say things like that. These days it just felt like a diagnosis. Mara didn't shake during a crisis. She never had. She saved the shaking for afterward, alone in a locked bathroom, where nobody in a 14-light-year radius could see the one part of her that wasn't built out of pure spite and training. The Vessari didn't share that respect. Why would they? Their healers didn't cut, they didn't stitch, they sang. Literally resonance chants that synced with a patient's neural chorus and coaxed the body back into balance using frequency and light. It worked. It worked constantly, beautifully, almost every single time, which was exactly why nobody on this planet had performed actual hands-on surgery in over 4,000 years. Why would you, when your ancestors already built something better? Mara had a theory about almost every single time, and she was about to get the worst possible chance to test it. She'd tried explaining her theory to Thessaly exactly once, back in her 2nd week, over what passed for coffee in this building, a lukewarm mineral tea that tasted like licking a battery. Mara had said, carefully, diplomatically, that resonance healing probably worked great for illness, for slow decay, for anything the body had time to negotiate with. But trauma didn't negotiate. Trauma didn't wait for a chorus to find the right key. A body bleeding out doesn't care how beautiful your song is. Thessaly had smiled the polite, pitying smile of someone listening to a child explain why the moon is made of cheese, and the conversation had ended there. Mara hadn't brought it up again. She'd just kept her scalpel packed, her hands steady, and her mouth shut, waiting for a day nobody wanted to come. That day had apparently decided to introduce itself on a Tuesday. The alarm didn't sound like an alarm. It sounded like grief. A low, mournful tone rolled through the spire's walls, and every Vessari in the observation hall stopped moving at once, their antennae drooping in perfect unison like a field of flowers wilting under the same invisible sun. Mara had been standing in the corner reviewing patient charts on a borrowed data slate, the only job they let her do, when the tone hit, and every single alien in the room physically flinched like they'd been struck. "What is that?" she said out loud, to nobody, because nobody answered her anyway. Elder Vessari, the Spire's head physician, staggered slightly against a support column. One clawed hand pressed to her sternum plate. Her 4 eyes had gone glassy. "The chorus," she whispered. "It's going quiet." Her Majesty, she didn't finish the sentence. She didn't need to. The doors at the far end of the hall split open with a hiss of pressurized air, and 6 royal guardians burst through carrying a levitating stasis cradle between them, moving at a dead sprint. Mara had seen a lot of things carried into trauma bays at a dead sprint. She had never once seen it be a person who was, according to the star charts on the wall behind her, the literal center of an entire planetary civilization. Queen Ora. Soul. Biological source of the Vessari Hive's collective consciousness. If the chorus was a radio station, she was the transmitter. Every mind on this world was tuned to hers, and if her signal died, 10 million minds went dark with her. They laid her on the central bioslab, and Mara got her first look at a dying god. Queen Ora's chitin, normally a deep royal violet that shimmered faintly gold, had dulled to the color of wet ash. Her abdomen, larger than a human's, built for a biology Mara only half understood, was grotesquely distended on one side, stretched tight and shiny like something underneath was trying to get out the wrong way. Her breathing spiracles fluttered in short, panicked bursts. And worst of all, for the first time in 6 months, Mara heard total silence in a room full of Vessari. No mental hum in their expressions. No shared grief flickering across a dozen faces at once. It was like watching a choir lose the song mid-note. "Bring the resonance chorus online," Vessari ordered, her voice cracking. Full spectrum. Now, the healing team moved fast, deploying floating crystal emitters that bathed the Queen in pulsing waves of violet-gold light. Mara watched the vitals scroll across a translated display panel and felt her stomach drop somewhere around her boots. Heart rate erratic, blood oxygen collapsing, and that swelling, that awful, tight, shiny swelling on her lower right abdomen, wasn't responding to a single pulse of light being thrown at it. "The resonance isn't penetrating," a junior healer said, panic bleeding into her voice for the first time Mara had ever heard from a Vessari. "There's a dissonance in the lower cavity. The frequency won't bind." "Of course it won't," Mara thought. "You're trying to sing a locked door open." Vessari increased the output. The lights flared brighter. The Queen's vitals kept sliding. And then, without warning, the readout flatlined. The chorus, that low collective hum that had been humming under every conversation in this building for 6 straight months, that Mara had genuinely started to find comforting in a background noise sort of way, just stopped. Every single Vessari in the room dropped their heads at once, a wave of grief moving through them like wind through wheat. Vessari lowered her healing wand and closed all 4 eyes. "She has crossed," Vessari said softly. "The Queen has returned to the chorus eternal." "She's crashed," Mara said. "That's a flatline, not a religious event. Start compressions." Nobody moved. "I said start compressions." Mara shoved her data slate onto a side table and took 2 fast steps toward the bioslab before a guardian's spear snapped down sideways, blocking her path at throat height. "You will not touch her," the guardian said. Warden Kyle. Mara had clocked him weeks ago as the type who saluted a little too crisply and smiled a little too rarely, the kind of soldier who followed every rule exactly and trusted absolutely no one who didn't. Right now his mandibles were clenched so tight they clicked. "Her Majesty has passed into the chorus. To disturb the vessel now is the gravest desecration our laws recognize. Your laws didn't stop her heart. Whatever's swelling in her belly did, and I can fix mechanical problems, not spiritual ones, so back off. You are not a physician of this world." "No," Mara snapped. "I'm the only physician in this room who's ever watched a heart stop and decided that wasn't the end of the conversation." KL's mandibles flared. "You would strike a bargain with death itself. That is not medicine. That is arrogance wearing a coat. Buddy, I've been called worse things by people bleeding out on my table, and every single one of them survived to apologize for it later. Move the spear." He didn't move the spear, but his grip on it loosened, just slightly, just enough that Mara clocked it and filed it away the way she filed everything in a crisis, useful later, not useful now. Here's the part where I'd normally tell you the crowd gasped. They didn't. They just stared. blank and silent. 10 aliens standing in a room where the background music of their entire species had just gone dead, and one loud, furious human refusing to accept the ending they'd already written in their heads. Honestly, I don't blame her for yelling. I'd have yelled too. A new voice cut through the standoff, younger, higher, edged with something raw. Let her try. Every head turned. Princess Sela, heir apparent, barely out of her chrysalis years by Vessari reckoning, stood in the doorway with violet tears already tracking down her faceplates. She looked terrified and furious in equal measure, which Mara found, in that moment, to be an extremely relatable combination. "Your Highness," Kale said, "the human intends to cut into her, to use metal. Blades, I know what she intends," Sela said, and her voice shook but didn't break. "Dr. Quinn, can you bring my mother back?" "I don't know," Mara said, because she'd learned a long time ago that hope built on a lie collapses harder than hope built on nothing at all. "But I know standing here doing nothing guarantees she's gone. Give me 3 minutes. If it doesn't work, you can do whatever you want to me after." Sela's antennae trembled once. "Do it." Kael's spear didn't move for a full second, quivering with barely restrained fury, and then slowly, furiously, he pulled it back. Mara didn't wait for him to change his mind. She crossed the last few feet to the bioslab, unzipped the battered olive drab medical bag she'd carried against every single regulation of this exchange program, and did something that had not happened inside the Threshold Spire in 4,000 years. She put her bare hands on the Queen's abdomen. The room actually recoiled, a physical ripple of alien bodies stepping backward in horrified unison, like she'd pulled a live wire out of a wall socket. Mara ignored it. She pressed her palms flat against the swollen right side, feeling for what her instincts, trained on 1,000 human bellies and 1,000 ambulances, were already screaming at her. Rigid, distended, hot to the touch in a way healthy tissue never was. She moved lower, pressing gently, then firmly, watching for a flinch that wasn't going to come because the Queen was unconscious, listening instead to what her fingers told her. "They're a hard mass, low and to the right, tender, angry, wrong. This isn't a cardiac event," Mara said out loud, mostly to herself, the way she always talked through a diagnosis because saying it kept her hands steady. "This is a rupture. Something in her lower cavity tore open, and whatever's inside is leaking into places it was never supposed to go. Her body's drowning in its own chemistry. That's why the light show isn't working. You can't sing a chemical fire back into its bottle. There is no medical record of Vessari anatomy rupturing in that region," Thessaly said, hovering closer despite herself. Curiosity briefly winning out over horror. "It isn't possible. With respect, Doc, 4,000 years of not cutting anyone open means 4,000 years of nobody actually looking." Mara reached back into her bag and pulled out a sealed surgical kit, the plastic crinkling loud as gunfire in the dead silent room. "I need this area open. Now." Her heart's not beating because there's no room left in her chest for it to try. Kyle made a strangled sound in his throat, but, to his credit, didn't raise the spear again. Mara found her landmark, took one breath, and pressed the blade down. The sound that came out of that incision wasn't blood. It was pressure, a sharp hiss of built-up gas and fluid releasing all at once. And beneath it, dark violet fluid welling up thick and fast against pale luminescent skin. 2 healers turned away. One made a retching sound into the crook of an arm. In their sterile, bloodless world, this was the single most horrifying thing any of them had ever witnessed a person do on purpose, and Mara didn't have the bandwidth to care, because underneath the blade, exactly where her hands had told her it would be, was the problem. A ruptured organ, swollen and split, spilling toxins straight into the body cavity. Mara's trauma instincts took over completely. The part of her brain that didn't need permission from fear or protocol or 4,000 years of alien tradition. She packed, she clamped, she worked with the fast, brutal efficiency of someone who had done this exact kind of controlled chaos in the back of a Black Hawk at 2 a.m. "I need suction," she barked. "Somebody get me suction. Or a bowl. Or your hands. I don't care which." Thessaly, trembling, stepped forward with a healer's tray and held it beneath the wound without being asked twice. Mara worked in silence for the next 90 seconds, sweat dripping off her jaw, forearms slicked to the elbow in alien blood. Every ounce of her focus narrowed down to the tear in front of her, and the clock running down in her head. Somewhere behind her she could hear Selah crying, quiet and controlled, the kind of crying a person does when they've been trained since birth never to fall apart in public. And some small, stubborn part of Mara's brain, the part that wasn't currently elbow deep in an alien queen, made a promise it had no business making. Not today. Not on my table. She found the source, clamped it, and felt something under her palm that made her go very, very still. Because right where the rupture ended, tucked against healthy tissue in a spot no natural injury should ever reach, her fingers found something that didn't belong there at all. Something hard. Something smooth. Something with edges too clean, too deliberate, to have grown there by accident. And that was the exact moment the monitor beside her let out a long, flat, screaming tone. And Queen Ora's heart, the heart Mara had just fought a war to save, stopped beating completely. Mara froze for exactly 1 second, staring down at the object under her fingertips, at the flat line crawling across the screen, at Kale's face going white with something that wasn't grief. It wasn't panic on him. It was recognition. "Everyone get back," Mara said quietly, and her voice had gone very calm in the way it only did right before things got worse. "Right now. Something's not right here. And I don't just mean the heart." Nobody moved. Thessaly stood frozen with the tray still shaking in her hands. Selah's tears had stopped completely, replaced by something sharper, something watching. And Kale had taken 1 step backward toward the door, slow and deliberate, the exact way a man moves when he's no longer sure which side of the room he wants to be standing on. Mara didn't have 3 minutes anymore. She barely had 30 seconds and a foreign object under her fingertips that had absolutely no business being inside a living body. Her training screamed at her to keep working, to restart that heart the same brute force way she'd done it 100 times before on 100 different tables. But some older, quieter instinct, the one that had kept her alive through 2 tours and 1 very ugly divorce, was screaming something else entirely. Somebody in this room already knew exactly what she'd just found. And Mara intended to find out who before this night was anywhere close to finished. Mara's fingers stayed locked around the object for exactly as long as it took her to make a decision she would have made in half that time back on Earth. She pulled it free. It came out slick with violet blood, small enough to fit in her palm, cold in a way nothing organic should ever be. A tiny lattice of dark metal, shaped like a burr, with 3 hair-thin filaments still twitching faintly where they'd been anchored into living tissue seconds ago. Not a tumor, not a birth defect. Not anything nature had ever made. Mara had spent 2 tours learning to recognize exactly 1 category of object that looked like this. Ordnance. "This isn't medical," she said, holding it up under the light so everyone in the room could see it. "This is a device. Somebody planted a rupture trigger inside your queen and timed it to go off tonight." The silence that followed wasn't grief this time. It was the specific, ugly silence of a room realizing it's been standing next to a murderer for who knows how long. Kyle's spear hit the floor, not dropped thrown, deliberately, the clatter of it echoing off the crystal walls as he lunged, not toward Mara, but toward the bioslab, toward the queen, his hand already closing around something at his belt that wasn't standard issue. If the seed failed, Kyle snarled, and his voice had dropped into a register none of them had heard from him before. Flat and cold and finally honest. Then the blade finishes what the seed started. Everything after that happened in about 4 seconds, and Mara would spend the rest of her life a little annoyed at how slow her own brain felt trying to keep up with it. A shape came off the observation platform behind her fast, low, human fast, which was a phrase that meant absolutely nothing to anyone in this room except Mara, because she was the only other person in the building built by the same brutal evolutionary pressure that had made her father's hands steady and her own reflexes just a hair quicker than they had any right to be. Commander Idris Voss hit Kale from the side like a linebacker who'd spent 4 years wondering when exactly he'd get to use the training nobody thought he'd ever need on this posting. Idris ran the exchange program's security liaison office, which on paper meant paperwork, badge scans, and translating human idioms for confused alien administrators. In practice, for 6 months, it had mostly meant standing near Mara in hallways, offering her truly terrible coffee, and pretending he wasn't watching to make sure the Spire's polite, quiet hostility toward her never turned into something worse. Mara had noticed, She'd told herself she hadn't. There's a special kind of stubborn that only shows up in people who've already lost enough that they'd rather not risk noticing anything good again. He noticed things about her too, he'd once mentioned, completely unprompted, over that same terrible coffee, that she chewed the inside of her cheek when she was worried, and never when she was actually in danger, only before. It had unsettled her how accurate that was. It had unsettled her more how much she liked being seen that clearly by somebody who wasn't trying to fix her. Right now, though, he wasn't thinking about coffee. He drove his shoulder into Kyle's ribs, and the two of them went down together in a tangle of armor and violet blood, skidding across the polished floor and slamming into the base of the observation platform. The blade some kind of ceremonial dagger, edges honed sharp enough to matter, clattered free and spun across the floor. "Get her clear," Idris shouted, pinning Kyle's weapon arm the same way he probably wished someone had taught him in whatever briefing prepared him for literally none of this. "Mara, work. I've got him." Mara didn't need telling twice. She spun back to the table, both hands slamming flat onto Queen Ora's chest, and the part of her brain that had spent 11 years learning exactly how much force a ribcage could take without breaking took over completely. "Vessari, get over here. Now. I need hands, not songs." Vessari, trembling, pale, absolutely nothing like the composed elder physician who'd greeted Mara 6 months ago with barely concealed disdain, crossed the sterile line without a second's hesitation this time. Something had shifted in her the moment the device came out of that wound. 4,000 years of certainty doesn't survive contact with proof that easily. "Tell me what you need," Vessari said, and her voice, for the first time, didn't sound like she was humoring a child. "Compressions. I'll show you the rhythm. Vessari cardiac tissue's tougher than human, so don't be gentle. Be exact." Mara guided the elder's clawed hands to the right position over the sternum, counted out loud. And together they began pushing rhythm back into a heart that had gone completely, deliberately silent. 1, 2, 3, 4. Somewhere behind them, Idris had Kyle's arms wrenched up behind his back. 2 royal guardians finally shaking off their own paralysis long enough to help pin him down. Kyle wasn't fighting anymore. He'd gone limp, defeated, muttering something in his own language that the room's translators didn't bother rendering, though from the look on Sela's face, she understood every word of it, and every word made her furious. "Keep going," Mara said, sweat running down her jaw, counting the compressions out loud in a steady cadence that had nothing to do with hope and everything to do with mechanics. "Don't stop. Don't you dare stop." The monitor stayed flat. 10 seconds. 15. Here's the thing nobody tells you about this part of the job, the part where the machine says no and you keep going anyway. It isn't brave. It doesn't feel brave. It just feels like stubbornness wearing a lab coat, and honestly, most days, that's all bravery ever really is. 20 seconds. 25. And then, under Mara's palms, something twitched. "There," she breathed. "There. Come on. Come on." The heart convulsed once, hesitated like it was deciding whether it still wanted this job, and then thundered back into rhythm, a hard, erratic beat that steadied within seconds into something almost recognizable as a pulse. The monitor screamed a warning tone that resolved, blessedly, into the ragged, glorious, uneven blip of a heartbeat that had absolutely no business existing 30 seconds earlier. And then something happened that Mara had no medical explanation for, because it wasn't medical at all. The chorus came back. It didn't come back quiet. It surged through the room like a held breath finally released, every Vessari present gasping in unison, antennae snapping upright, eyes flooding with tears that weren't grief this time. Sela actually staggered, catching herself on the edge of the platform, laughing and sobbing at the same time in a way that made absolutely no sense on a human face and made perfect, devastating sense on hers. "She's back," Sela whispered. "I can hear her again. Mother, I can hear you." Mara didn't have time to be moved by it. The queen's abdomen was still open, the incision from earlier gaping wide, and the ruptured organ underneath still needed closing before alive turned back into bleeding out, because bodies, alien or otherwise, are annoyingly unimpressed by emotional victories. "Somebody give me a status on the room," she called out, without looking up, because a trauma bay in chaos is exactly the moment you stop trusting your peripheral vision and start trusting your voice instead. Kyle is secured, Idris answered, breathing hard, still pinning the guard's shoulder to the floor with a knee that clearly wasn't going anywhere. 2 more guardians just placed the rest of his squad under watch. Whatever this was, it wasn't a one-man job. Noted. Deal with it after. I've got a queen mid-surgery and exactly 0 interest in a political briefing right now. Thessaly, I need the reweaving nanites, and I need you to trust me on how we're using them. Thessaly didn't hesitate this time. Tell me. Same as before. I close the structural gap by hand. You flood the seam the second I pull it tight. Your machines can't bridge open air, but they can absolutely finish what my hands start. They work together in a strange, unlikely rhythm. Mara's stitches, thick and crude and utterly foreign to this building, pulling torn tissue back into alignment, and Thessaly's shimmering silver swarm descending right behind her, sealing every gap at the cellular level almost as fast as Mara could create them. It shouldn't have worked. A 4,000-year-old philosophy of pure resonance healing had absolutely no protocol for being handed a needle and thread and told to catch up. And yet, stitch by stitch, swarm by swarm, the wound began closing clean. Idris appeared at Mara's shoulder somewhere in the middle of it, Kyle secured and dragged off by the guardians, his expression a complicated mixture of adrenaline and something softer that he clearly hadn't decided what to do with yet. "You good?" he asked quietly. "Ask me in an hour." Mara didn't look up from her work, but she felt him stay exactly where he was, close enough that his shoulder brushed hers every time she leaned forward. And she noticed the way she'd noticed everything about him for 6 months, and refused to admit it out loud that she didn't mind it. Didn't mind it at all. "For what it's worth," Idris said, low enough that it was just for her, "I've watched you get dismissed, ignored, and talked down to in 4 languages for 6 months, and you never once looked half this alive as you do right now. Elbow deep in an alien queen. That's either the strangest compliment I've ever gotten or the most accurate one. Can it be both?" Mara almost laughed. Almost she filed the moment away carefully, the same way she'd filed away Kale's loosening grip on that spear, useful later, not useful now, and went back to closing the last of the incision. Because a heart monitor doesn't care how good a moment feels, and neither apparently did she, at least not until this job was finished. It took another 40 minutes to fully stabilize Queen Ora. By the time the last suture was tied off, and the final wave of nanites sealed the wound into a smooth silver-violet scar, the entire trauma bay had the particular exhausted stillness of a room that had just survived something it wasn't built to survive. 3 days later, Mara stood at the observation window of the Royal Recovery Chamber, freshly showered. A clean uniform she'd worn maybe 4 times in 6 months, refusing as always to let anyone take the battered medical bag off her shoulder. Some habits you don't break, not even for royalty. Inside, Queen Ora sat upright on the biobed, her violet chitin restored to its full deep, gold-shimmering brilliance, looking every bit like a woman who had recently made death regret its life choices. Beside her stood Thessaly, Selah, and under-armed escort, awaiting formal judgment the answers to exactly who had wanted a queen dead and why. It turned out KL hadn't acted alone. He belonged to a hidden faction inside the Royal Guard itself, an old bloodline of traditionalists who believed the Queen's plan to formally open Vessari medicine to human trauma techniques, a treaty she'd been quietly drafting for months. One Mara hadn't even known existed until Selah mentioned it in a shaking, furious voice during the interrogation was an insult to 4,000 years of sacred practice. They'd rather bury the Queen than watch her hand a scalpel to the future. The interrogation itself hadn't taken long. Kyle, stripped of his rank and his weapons, had gone from cold defiance to a strange, hollow kind of relief within the first hour, the way people sometimes do once the worst secret they've ever carried is finally out where somebody else has to deal with it. He hadn't planted the device himself. A quieter conspirator inside the Spire's own maintenance staff had done that months earlier, patient enough to wait for the right night, but he'd known exactly when it would trigger. And he'd made absolutely certain he was standing in that trauma bay when it did, ready to finish the job with a blade if the biology failed to cooperate. It very nearly worked. That was the part that kept Mara up that first night more than anything else. Not how close the Queen had come to dying, how close everyone in that room had come to simply letting her. They had accounted for nearly everything. Poison the resonance response so no chant could catch it in time. Trigger the rupture on a night when suspicion would fall on natural biology instead of sabotage. What they hadn't accounted for was one stubborn, underestimated human refusing to accept a room full of people telling her the patient was already gone. The doors slid open. Sela stepped out into the hall, her posture straighter than Mara had ever seen it. The exhausted grief of 3 days ago replaced by something closer to steel. "Doctor, Quinn," she said. "My mother is asking for you." Mara followed her inside. Queen Ora's eyes sharp, oceanic gold fixed on her the moment she crossed the threshold, and for a long beat nobody said anything at all. "Doctor, Gregory once told me," Queen Ora finally said, though her voice carried real warmth this time instead of the formal distance Mara had grown used to from every Vessari official, "that human medicine was a philosophy of violence dressed up as compassion. I believed him, for most of my life. I no longer do. With respect, Your Majesty, it's not violence. It's honesty. Bodies don't negotiate. Sometimes the kindest thing you can do for one is stop being polite to it." The Queen actually laughed, a low, musical sound that rippled faintly through the chorus itself, and for one strange second, Mara swore she felt it, a faint warmth at the edge of her mind that shouldn't have been possible for someone permanently locked out of the collective. It faded as fast as it came. She decided not to mention it. Some miracles you just let happen quietly. "I am authorizing full construction of a new medical wing," the Queen continued, dedicated to trauma practice. "Staffed and led by you, Dr. Quinn, with full authority to train our healers in techniques my ancestors would have called barbaric, and I now understand simply as thorough. You will not be an observer in my hive any longer." Mara felt something settle in her chest that had been unsettled since roughly the day her ex-husband handed her divorce papers across a kitchen table in Ohio. "It would be an honor, Your Majesty. Fair warning, though my kind of medicine gets loud and messy, and it doesn't wait for permission." "Good," Queen Ora said simply. "We have been quiet long enough." Later that evening, Mara found Idris waiting for her outside the spire's east archway, 2 cups of that same terrible mineral tea in his hands. Because apparently he hadn't learned a single lesson from the last 6 months of her making a face every single time she drank it. "Figured you'd want to celebrate," he said, holding one out. "I know it's bad. I brought it anyway. You're either an optimist or you actively enjoy watching me suffer. Bit of both, honestly." He handed her the cup, and their fingers brushed for exactly 1 second longer than the transfer strictly required, and neither of them pulled away first. Mara looked out over the amber jungle canopy stretching toward the horizon, the low golden hum of the chorus drifting faintly through the walls behind her, a song she'd never fully belonged to, and, standing here right now, found she didn't mind. She had her own kind of song, steady hands, a stubborn heart, and apparently, now, a wing of her own to build. She glanced sideways at Idris, who was very deliberately not looking at her while very obviously watching her out of the corner of his eye, and for the first time in longer than she wanted to admit, Mara let herself think that maybe not everything worth saving needed a scalpel. "So," Idris said, after a long, comfortable silence, "new wing, new title, new legacy. Big week for you." "Massive." Mara took a sip of the tea and grimaced right on cue, and he grinned like he'd been waiting for it. "You planning on sticking around to see how it turns out, Commander? Or is this where the paperwork guy transfers somewhere with better coffee?" "Already put in the request to stay." He said it lighter than it clearly meant, watching her reaction a little too closely for someone pretending not to care. "Figured somebody around here should keep an eye on the human who keeps performing miracles against regulation." "Somebody's gotta," Mara said, and let the silence after that say the rest of it. Because some things land better unsaid, at least for tonight. If you made it all the way here, you already know exactly why this story hit the way it did, because sometimes the whole galaxy just needs one person too stubborn to accept a flatline. That's really the whole point of these stories, isn't it? Not the aliens, not the technology, just the reminder that giving up is always a choice, and some of us simply refuse to make it. If you want more stories exactly like this one, hit that like button, drop a comment telling us which part had you holding your breath, and make sure you're subscribed to HFY Soundscape so you never miss the next one. We'll see you in the next story.